When I was studying to go into ministry, one of my professors who taught preaching in our introductory preaching class told us that when you're a minister, always be prepared if you walk into a church on a Sunday morning for people to hand you the reins to the pulpit. Right? If you walk into some small church and you say that you're a preacher, be ready to give a sermon at any time. And I thought to myself, well, goodness, I could never do that. I could never just impromptu, on the fly, give a whole sermon. And I never have done that. Doing something off the cuff, impromptu. I've never done that until right now. So this morning, I had a message planned from the book of Acts, chapter 17, and I plan to still do that message, but it just doesn't feel right today. I came here this morning planning to give that regardless of who was here, but just something about the feeling this morning, just being here, talking to everybody, it just doesn't feel right to talk about that message. So we're going to do something a little bit different this morning. We'll see how it goes. But this morning, I want to direct your attention to the book of Revelation. The very last book in the Bible. And if you want to follow along, you can grab one of the Bibles on your pews. I believe they're all the same, but it's at the very back and page 259 of the New Testament. So just go to the back, open it up, flip to page 259 of the New Testament. Revelation is a book that if you hear people talk about it, it's always a little scary. Revelation is one of those books that brings to mind the end of the world. People think about apocalypse. They talk about judgment. Back when I was growing up, my church wasn't really into this series of books, but there was a series of books called Left Behind that was all about showing an interpretation of what the book of Revelation might look like. Now, there are some complicated issues there. And I really don't want to wade this morning into the issues and the nuances of what exactly the book of Revelation means. I do have my opinions about that, but it's way too big of a topic to bite off in one simple sermon. But I do want to give a little bit of context before we get into our reading. And it's going to be from Revelation 21, chapter 21, verses 1 through 6. But the book of Revelation, people think about apocalypse. They think about the end of the world. But in many ways, Revelation is less about things like when is Jesus coming back? When is the world going to end? And much more about how do we live as God's people in the midst of uncertain and difficult times. So the Apostle John, sometimes called John the Seer because of this vision, he's an old man at this point. He's seen a lot in his life. And John is one of the only apostles left, one of the only people left alive who remembers Jesus on earth, who walked beside him, who talked with him, who ate with him. He's seen a lot. He's been through a lot. But he's also seen the church be born and spread across the Roman Empire. But as often happens, when a strange group of people begins to pop up and begin growing in the midst of the dominant culture, that dominant culture looks at a minority culture and feels threatened by it. And Christians said some things and claimed some things that if you are the emperor of Rome, might feel subversive to you. They claimed that it was in fact not the emperor of Rome who was sovereign, who was appointed by the gods to bring peace and justice in the world. but that it was Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who lived and died and was raised from the dead. His kingdom would be the one that would have no end. His kingdom would be the one that would bring justice and peace into the world. And so Christians were often persecuted because they were different for their beliefs. John is exiled. We don't know exactly what happened, but most scholars think that he was one of these people that was dragged before a court for being a Christian. And rather than be sentenced to death or something to that effect, put in prison, he was sent to an island called Patmos that's in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. It's a small island. You stand on the top of it, you can see the whole thing. And he was sent there to work as a prisoner. And John, at the beginning of Revelation, says, I was with the exiles on Patmos. He says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, which just means on a Sunday he was praying. And he begins to have this series of visionary experiences. His friend, Jesus, comes to him and begins to show him these incredible visions. But at the end of it all, John is given an opportunity to see a window into where everything ends. Life is difficult. The world is unfair, unjust. As beautiful as it can be, it is often a dark and broken place. But the evil in the world, the wrong, the disruption, John gets the assurance that that's not what's going to have the last word. It may be a powerful thing, evil, but it is not the ultimate thing. And so, in chapter 21 of the book of Revelation, John talks about what he saw at the end. This is Revelation 21, verse 1. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them as their God, and they will be his people. And God himself will be with them. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more. For the first things have passed away. And the one who was seated on the throne said, See, I am making all things new. Also he said, Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true. Then he said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water as a gift from the spring of the water of life. It's an amazing image. This idea that these things that define our world so much, death, mourning and crying, pain in all of its many forms, will pass away. In verse 4, this voice that comes from the throne of God calls these things the first things. See, he says there are first things, or some translations will say former things, which begs the question, if these are the first things, what are the second things? What are the latter things, the final things that will define our lives? Now, there's a particular theme in this text that I want to highlight. In verse 3, he says, The home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. And if you're looking at a print Bible, next to home and dwell, there's, in this version, it's a little letter. It's the letter P. And if you go down to the bottom and find that other small letter P, you'll see the word tabernacle, or GK, which stands for Greek, which means in the original language that the Bible translated from, the word for home and dwell is tabernacle. And the reason the translators have chosen to use home and dwell is, for one thing, tabernacle is kind of a strange word in English. A lot of people don't know what that even is. And also, in Greek, it can have a noun and a verb form. But in English, tabernacle is not a verb. And so for stylistic reasons, they've chosen to go with a less literal translation and more the sense of what the text is saying. But if you translate it literally, what it says there is the tabernacle of God is among mortals, and he will tabernacle with them as their God. There's this theme of dwelling that runs through the entire story of Scripture. God created human beings in order to live with them and dwell with them. And when sin, when evil put a gap, divided human beings from God, God spent the next several thousand years finding ways to come close, to restore that broken relationship with human beings. And one of the ways he did so in the Old Testament was this structure called the tabernacle. And you can read about it in the book of Exodus. God has this desire to create a people for himself. And so he rescues the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt. And he makes a covenant with them, says, I will be faithful to you as your God. I will never leave you or forsake you. And he gives them a law to structure that relationship. And the visible sign of God's presence among the people was this thing called the tabernacle. It was a tent, a mobile sort of sanctuary, a very ornate tent, but it was the place where God's presence dwelled in a physical form. See, what this is showing here in Revelation is that this desire of God to live among people isn't something new. It's not something that came out of nowhere, but that God has always desired to bridge the gap between himself and us, to reach through the space between us, come to us in our hearts, know us, dwell with us. So when you talk about those were the first things, what are the second things? It's dwelling with God. And all of these images of heaven that people talk about, golden streets, it says here that there's a throne, there's a city that comes out of the sky to the new heavens and new earth. All of these are images trying to capture the beauty and the majesty of being in the presence of God, face to face. So dwelling, that's the first theme. And the second thing that I want to draw your attention to this morning is in verse 5. God says, "See, I am making all things new." I didn't come up with this idea, but I found it to be a very simple way to capture a profound truth. God doesn't say, "I am making all new things." He doesn't say, this whole world, it was a lemon, it's messed up, chuck it out, we're done. These people, I can't deal with them, throw them out, we'll start fresh. Not all new things, but all things new. It's the difference between an artist one artist who is creating a painting and a mistake is made. Something goes wrong, and that artist takes the canvas, chucks it out, and says, I'm starting over. It's the difference between that and another artist who makes a mistake. It's a pretty bad mistake in their painting. But instead of deciding it's not worth it to try and salvage this, they incorporate the mistake into the painting. They work around it. They work it into this beautiful artwork. And the final product is actually perhaps even better than it would have been before. All things new. And if you're like me, there have been times in your life where you've wondered, is this it? Is this just how it's going to be for me? Is this mindset that I'm in, this rut that I've fallen into, this cynicism from experiences I've had, am I always going to be jaded? Am I always going to be confused? Am I always going to feel this sense of loss? Whatever it is for you, I'm sure there have been times in your life you have wondered, is this as good as it gets? God here promises, I am making all things new. And folks, the most wonderful news in all of the world is that all things new means new for you. You too can be made new in Christ. Can begin that process at any time in your own life of allowing God to take the mistakes in the painting that is you and build it and make it into something wonderful and beautiful. It's a lifelong journey, but it's a promise from God. All things new means new for you.